Hey there folks, John here with Through My Lens, and today I'm coming to you with another knife-related video. Today I'm going to be taking a look at some of the generational differences found in the Koenig Arius. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, my video was inspired by a video that Fabrizio of Fabblades made earlier this year on the same topic. So do go and watch Fab's video. He has great lighting and a cooler accent than I do. I'll provide a link to his video in the description box. He has a great channel. I'm a subscriber, so you probably should be as well. Now we'll primarily be looking at these two knives and the differences between them. The first is a Generation 2 Koenig Arius with a born-on date of March of 2018. It was originally custom ordered from Bill Koenig. It has all of the accessory blue hardware already installed. That hardware normally is ordered separately off the Koenig website for about $30. But more importantly, it has a hand-rubbed CTS 204P blade that is just stunningly gorgeous. Really like that. It also exhibits the lightning pockets that are milled into the underside of the titanium handle scales, designed to save weight. I believe this is one of the first examples to exhibit this weight-saving feature. So this is a really pretty unique example of a plain Jane Gen 2 Arius. Now the second knife that we have here is less than 1 month old. It's a Gen 4 Arius born on November 10th of 2020. This one was not a custom order, but rather was one of a limited drop that Koenig did on their website. It's notable because it's one of the first run of the Koenig Arius, which has the new titanium pivot. It's anodized blue to match the rest of the hardware, and like this Gen 2, this one comes with that accessory blue anodized hardware already installed. And it also features a hand-rubbed M390 blade. Again, just love that hand-rub finish. Really quite stunning. So other than that anodized blue pivot, these two knives are essentially identical in configuration, which makes them ideal to compare their generational differences. So what are the differences between these two knives? Beginning with the presentation side of the knives, they really are nearly identical. However, if you look closely at the screws, you will see some very slight differences in appearance. Now, this is something that Fab didn't talk about in his review or his video on this topic. So I'd be curious to know, Fab, if you've noted this difference in the screws. Now, while both of these are T8, what I'm going to show you on the Gen 4 on the right is that the screws are slightly nicer finished and decorated than what you will see on the Gen 2 on the left. In particular, you'll note there's a kind of a flat ring that goes around the perimeter of the star-shaped insertion point, which again, it's just a nicer bit of finishing. They're both T8 screws. No functional difference there. Just a little bit prettier, a little bit nicer on the Gen 4. I do know that currently Koenig uses a company out of Montana called TI Connector or TI Connector for all of the hardware on his knives. I'm not sure if the same supplier was used on the Gen 2 or if the screws have simply been improved by TI Connector, but I thought I would point out the difference there that I'm seeing. Now, if we move to the clip side, we'll see some more differences. Now, the most significant difference that we see on the clip side is the Lockbar. Most of the generational differences in the Koenig Arius are very subtle and won't make a significant functional difference, but the Lockbar changes are more substantial. You will see on the Gen 4 on the right that the Lockbar is smaller than on the Gen 2, and the engagement with the blade tang appears to be slightly different. Let me illustrate. Again, the Gen 4 on the right, taking a look, trying to line them up as closely as I can, the lock bar on the Gen 4 on the right appears to be longer. You will see that The jimping pattern is slightly different, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But more importantly, you will see that the lockup is different on the two knives. You should see that the lockup is earlier on the Gen 4 on the right versus the Gen 2 on the left. And just to illustrate that that's just not simply a knife by knife variation, I have another Gen 4 example of the Arius with a carbon fiber handle scale that exhibits the same earlier Lockbar lockup as compared to the Gen 2. So pretty interesting. Now, given that there is a difference in the engagement at the blade tang, that would lead me to believe that the engagement also may be somewhat slightly improved. Again, lockup is certainly earlier on both of the Gen 4 examples that I have versus the Gen 2, which many would consider to be a substantial improvement. Now, the smaller size of the lock bar on the Gen 4 also has a functional advantage. On deployment, when you put your finger on the lock bar, you exert pressure, which in turn creates resistance and makes opening the knife harder. Generally, you don't want to put your finger on the lock bar if you can avoid it. So a smaller lock bar means there is less lock bar surface on which to place your finger and potentially interfere with deployment. The jimping on the Gen 2 lock bar also has a slightly different pattern, as I illustrated earlier, and it's a bit sharper and less comfortable when you're trying to close the knife than on the Gen 4. It's very subtle, but it is noticeable, and some actually may prefer the more aggressive jimping on the Gen 2. My preference is the Gen 4. You'll also see that the screw that holds the lock bar insert is significantly smaller than on the Gen 2. Gen 4 again on the right, Gen 2 on the left. This one is smaller. Now, again, on this side of the knife, on the Gen 4, you can see that there is a blade demarcation that's present on the Gen 4, showing that it has an M390 blade that is not present on the Gen 2. Let me go ahead and bring this up so that you can see it a little bit more clearly. Yeah, hopefully you can see that the M390 blade marking there on the Gen 4. The Gen 2, by comparison, does not have that. Now, in his video, Fob indicated that that blade steel demarcation started around Gen 3. Now, I think it's important to note that both Böhler M390, as found on this Gen 4, and Carpenter's CTS 204P are quite nearly identical, chemically and in use. So I wouldn't consider a Gen 2 Arius better or worse on the basis of the blade steel. Now, Koenig has also used CTS XHP steel in previous generations, which is considered to be a super steel, but not quite as corrosion resistant or as good at edge retention as the M390. Now, if we take a look at the flipper tab on the Gen 4 and the Gen 2, we will see some differences. Taking a look at the Gen 2 first, it does have kind of a horn or a point where your finger engages with it. That's very, very similar in design to a Hinderer XM18. Some people find that point a little uncomfortable. I don't find it particularly uncomfortable when you flip the knife once, but if you're one of the guys that likes to really fidget with their knife and flip it over and over and over, you probably will find that to be uncomfortable eventually. By comparison, the Gen 4 is flatter where your finger engages, so no sharp point there, and you will also see that it exhibits jimping where that is not present on the Gen 2. Again, I think both are fine, and it's really not a big deal one way or the other, but a slight improvement in the Gen 4. Now, if we take a look at the blade itself, there are some subtle differences in the blade that Fab doesn't talk about in his video that I do want to point out. Now, the hand rub finish on each knife is nearly identical, and I think it looks fantastic. The grind lines on the Gen 2 extend horizontally and abruptly end Again, this is the Gen 2, this is the Gen 4. It ends really abruptly in kind of a plunge grind with a very nice squared off 90-degree angle between the primary and the secondary grind. It also appears this way in the Gen 3, which Fab has in his video as well. Now the Gen 4 exhibits a more gradual hollow grind and a rounded transition between the primary and the secondary grind. Let me go ahead and hold this up so that you can see what I'm talking about here. You can see there's, pardon the fingerprint that's there, but you can see that there's kind of a rounding or a hollowing that is not present on the Gen 2 here. Again, much more abrupt into what I think many would consider to be a traditional plunge grind. Now, the Gen 4 also exhibits a larger sharpening choil than what's found on the Gen 2. So the Gen 2 actually has a longer cutting edge that some may prefer over the Gen 4. Just going to grab a cleaning cloth here to get rid of that fingerprint that's on this knife. Okay, so let's talk about the weight of the two knives. Both of them exhibit the lightning milled out pockets, the lightning pockets, that again I think first appeared in Gen 2. But there's a little bit of a weight difference. It's not much. Weighing the Gen 2 first, we see it comes in at just above 5 ounces at 5.01 ounces. Weighing the Gen 4, it comes in at 4.83 ounces. Quite honestly, I don't know specifically what to attribute that weight difference to. I can speculate that some of that weight difference comes from the difference in the titanium pivot versus the stainless steel pivot. Don't know if that would account for the entire weight difference, or if perhaps there are some subtle changes to the lightning pockets in the Gen 4 that are an improvement over the Gen 2. What I can tell you is that in hand, these knives feel pretty identical to me. I cannot perceive that, I guess, 0.18 ounce difference in their weight. So I certainly wouldn't choose the Gen 2 or the Gen 4 over the Gen 2 on the basis of the weight difference alone, because it's pretty imperceptible, at least to me. Now, in his video, Fab talks about the tolerances being improved from Gen 2, Gen 3 into Gen 4, and that the action is slightly better from Gen 3 to Gen 4, and even more when comparing Gen 2 to Gen 4. Now, I can neither confirm nor deny these changes in the tolerances. Fab has more experience here and may know either directly from Bill Koenig himself or from perhaps an internet post that indicates these changes in tolerances. I do know Koenig is committed to quality improvement, so I have no doubt that he consistently is improving the tolerances at which he manufactures his parts. What I will say is that the action of these knives is far more subjective. Now, if I compare, for example, this Gen 2 PJ and my Gen 4 carbon fiber model, I can tell you that I do prefer the action on the Gen 2. Why? Because the detent on this Gen 4 carbon fiber model is pretty strong. I can definitely tell a difference in the detent on this knife versus the Gen 2 plain Jane model. It's subtle, but it's perceptible. I would have to say that the Gen 2 detent is preferable. However, when I compare the Gen 2 plain Jane detent in action to this Gen 4, I can tell you that this Gen 4 has the best detent and overall action of any knife that I have ever tried in my entire life. The detent is perfectly dialed in to my taste. The action is beyond reproach. This knife is, for all intents and purposes, from my point of view, perfect. Really fantastic. I'm really blown away by the action of this knife. My point here is that there is enough variations in the detents within a generation, as I demonstrated between my two Gen 4s, this carbon fiber and the plain Jane one, that it's extremely difficult to definitively call one generation better than another from a detent standpoint. I would simply need far greater numbers of both of these generations to be able to compare. Again, I think you're going to find some variation in the detent within the generation, so little subtle differences in the action within each generation that it really muddies the waters when trying to compare one generation to the other. So I would hesitate to say that the action is definitively better on the Gen 2 than the Gen 4. On paper, probably that's a true statement, but again, actually comparing one knife to the other, you may find a difference than what you would think in theory should be the case. Now, what I did want to point out is another difference that I'm seeing, not necessarily between generations, but within variations on the Koenig Arius within a generation. Let's take a look at the spine of the blades on both of these plain Jane models. You will see that there is what appears to be a bead blast finish on the top side or the spine of the blade that gives it a color and a finish that's very similar to what's found on the titanium handle scales. It creates a very uniform, kind of monochromatic transition from the blade to the handle scales that looks fantastic. I really like that. However, let's take a look at the blade spine on the carbon fiber example of the Arius. You'll see a definite difference in the finish. It's brighter. It appears to be perhaps a stonewash finish, or might even be the same kind of brushed finish that's on the primary grind here. I'm not certain, but it is definitely different. It has a different look to that finish than on both of the plain Jane models, which I find really interesting. Again, at this price point, at this level of manufacturing, it's the details, it's these subtle details which Bill Koenig puts into his knives that really do make them so interesting. And I find this particular difference to be pretty fascinating. Again, Fab, I'd be curious to know if you've seen that kind of a difference in your knives as well. So in conclusion, I think the question that everybody has, when they take a look at these two knives is the Generation 4 Arius necessarily better than the Gen 2? Now in his video, Fab says you can't go wrong with either one, and I have to strongly agree here. The generational differences, even if you look at Gen 2 versus Gen 3 to Gen 3 to Gen 4, they're very, very subtle. There are some Gen 2 features that some people may actually prefer over a Gen 4. So again, it's very difficult to say that the Gen 2 is not as good as the Gen 4, or vice versa. Some may ask if a Gen 2 Arius is less valuable. I would tend to argue no, because as Koenig has grown, demand really has increased for the Arius, and so did his production capability and capacity. So I think it's reasonable to assume that there are probably less Gen 2 knives than there are Gen 3 or Gen 4 knives. So from a scarcity standpoint, it stands to reason that in time, the Gen 2 could well be more valuable than the subsequent generations. Regardless, the Arius of any generation is one of the best mid-tech production knives in the world. It's one of my favorite knives, and the knife community really has embraced the Koenig Arius as a top tier, as one of the most desirable knives that someone can own. Well, there you have it. There's my comparison of the generational differences in the Koenig Arius. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Take care, God bless. We'll see you in the next one. I hope you've enjoyed this production from the Through My Lens YouTube channel. If you did, please click on the like button and do share the video on social media. If you'd like to see more content like it, please do subscribe to the channel, follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and do check out Through My Lens at www.throughmylens.org.